Okay, now we're going to move into our next chunk of history, our mid-century history in the United States. So first we're going to talk about the waves of immigration in the United States, specifically throughout the 1800s. And so this shows a couple different groups or waves of immigration. So over here we have primarily Chinese immigration coming into California. This was primarily in response to the gold rush as well as the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Many Chinese laborers were hired for very cheap labor and given very dangerous jobs. And many Chinese immigrants were willing to do this because they so desperately wanted to get out of the situation of their country at the time, which was not good. And, they had this idea that they could come here and make a better life. And again, that kind of hard work equals success and chasing the American dream. We also have primarily European immigration, which instead of coming through California, came through New York and Ellis Island. And of course, each European country or groups of people might have had different reasons for fleeing at different times. An example that comes to mind is the Irish potato famine, which created kind of a crisis for families where they needed to leave their farms and come and seek for a way to care for their family or continue to move up the financial ladder and maybe have some more freedom to do that or perceived freedom to do that if they were to immigrate to the United States. And so, of course, a great thing to think about with that is to connect this to yourself. So you're here as an au pair. Maybe you're thinking of staying here just temporarily. This is just a small stage in your life and experience. And maybe for many of you, this is a part of a journey into stepping into a more permanent move to the United States. And so the question I pose to you is, have you ever considered moving permanently to the United States of America? Why or why not? So I'll give you 30 seconds to ponder or consider. Okay, we're ready for our next topic or event. This is a video that is going to give an overview of key historical events that helped the United States grow from a small, insignificant force to the giant global superpower it is today. So it'll take us from pretty early on into United States history and end with the presidency of Donald Trump.
The modern United States is the most powerful country in human history, with over 800 military bases and 37% of global military spending. The US has become the leader of a vast, interconnected global system that has helped usher in an era of unprecedented prosperity and low levels of conflict. To understand America's position in the world, and why it's so pivotal for world politics as we know it, you have to go back to the country's founding, back to when America wasn't a global power in any sense of the word. During the first 70 years of its existence, the United States expanded in both territory and influence in North America, eventually reaching the Pacific Ocean, in a wave of expansionism that resulted in the wholesale slaughter of the indigenous people who populated the continent. But early Americans were deeply divided as to whether the country should expand beyond the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. This became a major debate after the Civil War, when some leaders, like post-war Secretary of State Seward, argued that America should push to become a global power. Seward succeeded in pushing a plan to purchase Alaska from Russia, but his attempts to buy Greenland and Iceland, as well as annexed territory in the Caribbean, were all blocked by Congress. That's because some Americans, including many on Capitol Hill, had a strong anti-imperialist bent. These people worried about America getting more involved in global politics, as well as having to integrate populations from quote-unquote inferior races. And this opposition implied major checks on the imperialist urge to expand. But something was happening in the late 1800s that would change the debate about American expansionism. The Industrial Revolution produced explosive economic growth, and the bigger US economy required a more centralized state and bureaucracy to manage the growing economy. Power became concentrated in the federal government, making it easier for expansionist presidents, like William McKinley, to unilaterally push American influence abroad. The key turning point came in 1898, when President McKinley dragged the country into war with Spain over Cuba, despite some intense domestic opposition. The rising United States easily defeated the moribund Spanish Empire, acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in the process. Over the next 2 years, the US would annex the Kingdom of Hawaii, Wake Island, and American Samoa, A few years later, the US took control of the Panama Canal Zone and sent troops to occupy the Dominican Republic. It also purchased the American Virgin Islands. This period of rapid acquisition of far-flung territories put the US on the map as a truly global power. During this time, America also began using its influence to protect its growing commercial and military interests abroad, installing pro-American regimes in places like Nicaragua, and playing a major role in international diplomacy regarding the Western presence in China. World War I showed just how much America's influence had grown. Not only was American intervention a decisive factor in the war's end, but President Wilson attended the Paris Peace Conference, which ended the war, and attempted to set the terms of the peace. He spearheaded America's most ambitious foreign policy initiative yet, an international organization called the League of Nations, designed to promote peace and cooperation globally. The League, a wholesale effort to remake global politics, showed just how ambitious American foreign policy had become. Yet isolationism was still a major force in the United States. Congress blocked the United States from joining the League of Nations, dooming Wilson's project. During the Great Depression and the rise of Hitler, the US was much more focused on its own region than on European affairs. Ultimately, America's ever-growing entanglements abroad made it impossible for it to stay out of global affairs entirely. In East Asia, the growing Japanese Empire posed a direct threat to American possessions and troops, bringing the United States and Japan into conflict. This culminated in the Pearl Harbor attack, bringing the United States into World War II. World War II would transform America's global presence forever. The United States was the only major power to avoid economic ruin during the war, and it was the sole country equipped with atomic weapons. As such, it was in a unique position to set the terms of the peace, and, with the aim of preventing another war in mind, it took advantage. The most famous example of this is the creation of the United Nations. The UN Charter set up a system of international law prohibiting wars of conquest, like the ones waged by the Nazis and the Japanese. It also served as a forum in which the international community could weigh in on disputes and help resolve them. This way, the Americans hoped, great powers could resolve their differences through compromise and law rather than war. But while the UN is the most famous of the post-war institutions, it isn't the only one. 730 delegates from all 44 allied nations came together in a small vacation haven in New Hampshire. Their goal? To establish a global financial system that would prevent another Great Depression and World War. The resulting agreement, called the Bretton Woods Agreement, ultimately became the backbone of the global financial system, resulting in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. By creating these institutions, the United States committed itself to being deeply involved in the world's problems. The issue, though, is that the world's second largest power, the Soviet Union, saw things differently. World War II had made allies out of the democratic West and communist East in the fight against Hitler, but that couldn't last. The United States saw Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and elsewhere as a direct threat to its vision of a free-trading, democratic world.
To a substantial degree, in one form or another, socialism has spread the shadow of human regimentation over most of the nations of the earth, and the shadow is encroaching upon our own liberty.
Fearful of Soviet intentions towards Western Europe, the US and other European nations created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance meant to stop Russia from invading other countries in Europe. Globally, the US committed to a strategy called containment, so called because it was aimed at containing the spread of communism everywhere on the globe. This new global struggle meant that the US had to exert influence everywhere, all the time. Instead of disbanding the massive military machine created for World War II, the wheels mostly kept turning. This had two main results. First, the US was pulled into unlikely alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and South Korea, seeing each of them as bulwarks against communist influence in their region. Secondly, the US began intervening, often secretly, in dozens of countries to contain Soviet influence. Sometimes this meant propping up sympathetic dictators, like in Iran. Other times, it meant supplying rebels with arms and money, like in Afghanistan in 1979 and Nicaragua in 1985. Over the course of the Cold War, the US intervened in hundreds of disputes around the globe, ending up with a complicated set of alliances, tensions, and relationships in basically every corner of the Earth. After the Berlin Wall fell, the US could have withdrawn from the system, severing ties with its allies and drawing down the size of its military. And while the US did decrease military spending, much of the military infrastructure and alliances from the Cold War remained. Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton decided that it was in both America and the world's interest for the United States, now the sole superpower on Earth, to continue actively managing global affairs.
We should be and we must be peacemakers.
NATO, created solely as a tool for countering the Soviet Union, stayed together and even expanded, a way of keeping European nations united in the absence of the Soviet threat. Washington's support for countries like Israel and Japan stayed intact, ostensibly as a means of preventing war in their respective regions. The global system of alliances and institutions created to keep the peace during the Cold War became permanent, as did the American military and political commitments necessary to keep them running. This system remains in operation today, and no leading American politician since the Cold War has seriously called for dismantling it. Except, perhaps, for Donald Trump. Trump has said contradictory things about these commitments, but he's consistently argued that American allies are not paying the U.S. enough for its protection, and questioned the value of free trade. That calls NATO and even the World Trade Organization into question.
At some point, we have to say, you know what? We're better off if Japan protects itself against this maniac in North Korea. We're better off, frankly, if South Korea is going to start to protect itself.
Saudi Arabia,
we have Saudi Arabia, absolutely.
This is a sharp divergence from the consensus that has dominated U.S. foreign policy since 1945, and something closer to the isolationism that came before it. So will President Trump act on some of Canada Trump's ideas and reverse decades' worth of institution building and alliances? We'll find out soon enough.
All right, thank you for enjoying that video with me, and I hope that gives you a good picture of how the United States has grown in its power and influence and what that means for the world today. And now we have the opportunity to look back on President Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency and kind of see, as this video calls into question, what's the United States going to do now, and what direction are we beginning to take now? And of course, what's that going to look like with President Biden and any future president that comes into power? And that leads us to another thing to pause and consider. Do you think it is a powerful country's right to intervene in global affairs? And in a related, or a little bit separate but also related, do you think it is their responsibility to intervene in global affairs, and why or why not? So I'll give you 30 seconds to consider that. This brings us to our next event that we're going to discuss, which is the Great Depression and the New Deal era of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency. And we're just going to go ahead and watch this video that will explain it for us.
Let's say the United States has just plunged into the worst depression in its history, and you are the president of those same United States. What do you do? Well, if your name is Herbert Hoover, then you would say something about laissez-faire individualism and do nothing. But if your name's Herbert Hoover, then you're also going to be remembered for being wrong. So let's skip ahead a few years and say now you're Franklin Roosevelt. You have a much better idea, which you call the New Deal. This program ran from 1933 to 35 and broke down into 3 goals: relief, recovery, and reform. It all started with what became known as the first 100 days, during which Congress passed an unprecedented amount of legislation. First up was a banking holiday. For 2 days, every bank across the country was shut down and investigated. The well-behaved banks were then allowed to reopen, while the rest were put under government control. The government then put some broad restrictions over the banks while also creating the FDIC, which would act as insurance for banking deposits. These 2 measures were designed to restore Americans' confidence in the banking system. Also aimed at restoring confidence were FDR's fireside chats, in which he spoke weekly to the American people through the radio in a reassuring voice and told them what was going on. More practical was the so-called alphabet soup of new government agencies that sprang up. In no particular order, there was the Public Works Administration, which paid people to rebuild roads, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which paid younger people to plant trees, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built hydroelectric dams in Tennessee, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which helped farmers by paying them to not farm, and the National Recovery Administration, which placed productive regulation on industry, just to name a few. But as it turned out, All that wasn't enough. Roosevelt then launched the Second New Deal, which ran from 1935 to 1938. It was basically more of the same, adding the Works Progress Administration for artists and the Social Security Act for old and out-of-work people to the alphabet soup. So, did it work? In a word, kinda. FDR did greatly expand the role of the federal government in people's lives and likely save the economy from getting much worse. But government spending is a complicated thing. For all the good the New Deal may have done, 1937 and 38 still saw the Roosevelt recession when FDR tried to cut back on spending just a little. And even on his best day, FDR never got unemployment below 16%. That is, until World War II.
This brings us to our final event for the mid-century. This would be the Civil Rights Movement. The first Civil Rights Movement to occur in the United States was primarily headed by leaders such as Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and this primarily took place during the 1950s and 60s and was a unified effort to end segregation, increase African American rights and equality. But of course, this wasn't the end-all be-all of civil rights movements. Unfortunately, this is something that is still very needed for many minority groups today. Another example would be a more recent civil rights movement among the LGBTQ community. So that ends our mid-century events section of the timeline. Again, I'd like us to pause and consider, how did these events shape these four elements of the American dream? And conversely, how did these events also get shaped by these elements of American dream? So, how might something like the Civil Rights Movement help solidify and create altruism? And how might altruism have helped the Civil Rights Movement happen the way it happened? And I will give you guys about 30 seconds to consider. Okay, that takes us to our third and final section of historical events in our more current climate. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some famous innovators from the United States that have created a big impact today. So we've got Walt Disney, and he was, someone who grew up in maybe not the safest home, doesn't come from a super wealthy background. He wanted to become an animator and had all these big ideas about things he wanted to create, but he faced many obstacles, many setbacks, many problems, and he continued to work through them. And now, of course, Disney is the empire, the entertainment empire that it is today. In the middle, we have Oprah Winfrey, who came from a very difficult home life, lived in inner city Chicago, was able to end up on some local news channels and work her way up into having her very own her very own entertainment station, talk show, very huge influence on the American people even today, and is very vocal about minority rights and making their stories more visible and more heard. And then finally, on the far right, we have Steve Jobs, who is one of the main creators of Apple. He was actually kicked out of his own company early on in Apple's history because they thought his ideas were too expensive and too innovative. And eventually, years later, they begged Steve Jobs to come back as the company was prepared to go under and had made very little progress in the computer industry. And he came back and went on to launch things like the iPhone and the iPad and many different computer innovations that we all still enjoy today. And so these are some great rags to riches story that come from more recent American history. Something to consider with these three people, Walt Disney, Oprah Winfrey, and Steve Jobs, is we have this chart that shows the distribution of all employees by race and ethnicity and career level. So for example, people who are in the executive career level in their company, make more money, have better benefits, have more leadership. We can see that primarily whites are in these positions of executives. And then you look at senior managers, still primarily white. And then as we go down into the manager section, we start to see a small increase in other ethnicities. And essentially, this is showing the idea that, hey, this American dream, that hard work equals success, is that actually true for everybody? Is this quote unquote equal playing field for all people from all types of backgrounds to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labor and to truly be compensated or rewarded for what they are doing for their community and for their industry? So as we look at those three stories and then that chart, we would like to have you pause and consider what are the positives of hearing these rag to riches stories and what are the negatives of hearing these rag to riches stories. This brings us to the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the post-terrorist attacks and some of the events that happened in regards to that. So these are pictures of the Twin Towers in New York City, which both had airplanes, commercial airplanes, fly into them as an act of terrorism. These are the stories that are most discussed, but there was also a plane that landed into the Pentagon, and a plane that was intended to crash into the White House, but the passengers fought back and regained enough control of the plane to have it crash land in Pennsylvania. And of course, unfortunately, their entire plane died in that crash, but they were able to prevent more deaths by having it crash there instead of reaching its intended target. So my brother and his partner live in New York City, and it's very interesting to talk to them about the 9/11 attacks because they lived in New York before and after. And so they talk a lot about how for a few months after the 9/11 attacks, people on the subway were a lot more friendly, talking to each other, checking in with each other. People were more likely to give up their seat if they saw someone that had a lot of groceries or looked tired or was a young mother or perhaps someone who was elderly and wasn't able to stand for as long. And that they saw such a sense of community coming together, less racism, less anger, less contention, and more unity. And unfortunately, about 20 years later or so, 20 plus years later, that isn't necessarily still the case. Maybe there's still some good that has come out of this and still some unity that has come out of this, but definitely not as much as there was, right after these events. And if you haven't had an opportunity to look into some of the stories of first responders who were able to go into these buildings and seek to rescue people on the street that were civilians themselves and got involved to try to help other people stay safe, it is definitely something worth looking into. There's a wonderful museum in New York that you can visit at Ground Zero, where the Twin Towers used to stand, that does a great job of depicting some of these stories of selflessness and heroism that can be very inspirational to us even today. So with that information, here's some more food for thought. Why do you think tragedy can be such a powerful unifier? And what has to happen in order for an event to unify instead of to divide? This same event could have brought about and in some cases, unfortunately, did bring about increased hate, increased racism. And so why does that sometimes the response, and why other times is the response to come together as a community and to become stronger because of it? All right, I hope that was enough time for you to consider those thoughts. So this brings us to the end. I have given you a brief overview of some significant historical events, hopefully from a couple different perspectives. Of course, not all perspectives. So as that second objective encourages you to do, it's very important that you take the conscious time and intentional time to look at these same events from maybe some perspectives I didn't discuss today to get a more complete picture. But with what you have so far with these current events or more current events, how has things like our response to 9/11, our rag to riches stories and things like that, how does that connect to individualism, hard work, manifest destiny, altruism, And as I said before, how has individualism, hard work, manifest destiny, and altruism perhaps shaped the way that these historical events have gone down and how they ended up in the grand scheme of things. All right, so now that we've looked at some previous historical events, let's think about our response to COVID-19, or specifically the United States response to COVID-19, and looking at it from the early stages to the mid stages to the end stages to the post stages. How has individualism, hard work, manifest destiny, and altruism come into play during this more recent and very devastating historical event that has, of course, happened worldwide, but specifically how the United States has responded to this crisis? And again, I hope that was enough time. And that takes us to the close of our history of the American dream. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and going over these important historical events. I hope it was an opportunity for you to not only learn more about American history, but more importantly, how those historical events have been such an impact and such a part of our origin story, and help explain perhaps why American culture, Americans respond or act the way that they do. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.